welcome Mason High School. Are they they're gonna stand now instead of sit? Okay, you're all gonna stand because otherwise we couldn't see the slides. So you have 15 minutes to present. I'm gonna give you a 5-minute warning, a 2-minute warning, and a 1-minute warning. I'm just a bit hard to see over here because you're gonna wanna look out to the audience, but I'll make sure you guys see the cues. Yeah, and then after that, we'll ask you about 5 minutes of questions and you'll have some time to thank whoever you wanna thank. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and get started.
Hi, my name is Minja Zhang.
My name is Anish Iyer.
My name is Raymond.
And my name is Ramya.
And my name is Vivian, and we are team 18111, representing William Mason High School from Mason, Ohio. Today, we will be presenting our solution to hot button issue, staying cool as the world heats up for our chosen city of Memphis, Tennessee. Last summer in Memphis, a mother had to move her daughter's oxygen tank into the car because the air inside their home was too hot, too dangerous to breathe. This isn't a future issue. It's happening now to neighborhoods that aren't equipped to handle the heat. Elderly die, and workers die while on the clock, and the elderly suffocate in their homes, and children aren't able to live their lives. The need to act isn't merely academic, it's deeply human. Now, Minja will begin with Model 1. Hot to go.
The dangerous reality of heat waves is a constant for populations without access to air conditioning in summer months. In the first problem, we aim to model the indoor temperature of a non-air-conditioned dwelling in Memphis over a 24-hour heat wave day. Our key assumptions for this problem may be condensed into the following 2 points. First, we assume that residents follow all recommended heat mitigation practices, and next, we make some assumptions for model simplicity. Dwellings have square floor plans with 10-foot-tall stories and have a uniform internal temperature. In developing our model, we hypothesize that changes in indoor temperature result primarily from 2 factors: solar radiation and heat transfer through the walls of the home. In order to account for the time-based nature of these factors, as well as the fact that heat transfer itself may be expressed as a differential equation, we utilize a differential model to relate indoor temperature to time-varying functions of external temperature and solar irradiance. Shown here is our starting differential equation. Inside the parentheses is the rate of energy transfer through the home, composed of components Q-rad, or solar radiation, and Q-flow, or heat conduction through the walls of the home. This is divided by the heat capacity of the home, defined as the amount of thermal energy required to raise the temperature of the dwelling by 1 degree Celsius. And by dimensional analysis, this equation yields us the rate of indoor temperature change. To first model solar radiation entering the dwelling, we take the global horizontal irradiance, which is defined as the amount of sunlight hitting a horizontal surface at any given point in time, and we apply 2 coefficients to it in order to account for solar radiation blocked from entering the home. R sub S represents blocking by shade around the house, while R sub W represents blocking by walls around the house. Next, in order to model heat conduction through the walls of the home, we apply a modified form of Fourier's law, which expresses the dependence of heat conduction rate across a surface, in this case a wall, on the difference in temperature between the 2 surfaces of the wall. In lieu of traditional parameters of thermal conductivity and wall thickness, we utilize a construction industry standard of R value, directly proportional to the insulatory capacity of a wall. Notably, in order to account for the warming of outside surfaces due to solar radiation absorption, we add a factor of 50 degrees Celsius to the ambient external temperature in order to obtain the temperature of the outside surface of the home. We then determine the heat capacity of the home based on the volume of air in the dwelling and existing physical parameters. Finally, after calculating the total surface area of the walls in the home and substituting all of our prior expressions into our initial equation, we obtain our final model. It is dependent on 2 time-varying functions, external temperature and global horizontal irradiance. All other parameters are constants found through either literature review or provided in the M3 dataset. Next, Anish will explain the results of our first model.
We collected hourly temperature and global horizontal irradiance data based on 4 different past heat wave events in Memphis. We then used Python to optimize time-based regression inputs for our model. We will now apply our model to 4 different homes. Home 1 is a 1-story single-family residence built in 1953. Home 2 is a ground floor unit located in an 8-unit complex built in 1967. Home 3 is a 15th floor apartment located in a 30-unit complex built in 2003. And Home 4 is a 2-story single-family residence built in 1990. On the left, we show our input parameters based on the curated M3 dataset, and on the right is our results. We found that Home 3 had the greatest temperature fluctuation due to its small size and lack of shade, whereas Home 1's temperature remained relatively stable due to its deep shade. To validate our model, we searched for real-world examples. A WREG Memphis report from the June 2023 heat waves shared that a resident's home reached up to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. This converts to roughly 31.7 degrees Celsius and aligns with our model's prediction for Home 3, highlighting its real-world relevance. To analyze the sensitivity of our model, we jittered two parameters. On the left, varying the amount of sunlight that was hitting the home through the global horizontal irradiance found that it had a significant effect on indoor temperatures, whereas variations in the R parameter, representing the wall insulation, had minimal effect. The main strength of our model is its adaptability to multiple dwelling-specific characteristics that can be easily determined, though we understand that it is fairly rudimentary with its assumption that all expert guidelines are being followed. I will now pass it on to Raymond to explain our second model.
Q2 asked us to predict the peak demand that Memphis should be prepared to handle during the summer months this year and 20 years from now. In the provided dataset, we were given the Shelby County's annual electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. However, if we simply conducted a univariate time series analysis, this graph will quickly extrapolate to 0. And also, is this even the metric that we want? Looking at this graph back from Q1, we see that indoor temperatures peak after outside temperatures, indicating that people will be using more power for cooling in the evenings. If this increased power usage is excessive, this could lead to a power outage. Hence, we use peak hourly load alongside total consumption to define peak demand. Whereas total consumption tells companies how much energy they should be generating to sustain a population for an entire month, peak hourly load tells them how much power the grid should be able to transmit for any given instant. We then chose two key predictors for peak demand, population and maximum temperature, and plot them side by side with our peak demand variables. We see that peak hourly load shares the same W shape as maximum temperature, and that total consumption shares the same downwards trend as population. This motivated us to use our multiple linear regression as shown here for its interpretability and simplicity. Despite the p-values for the peak hourly load multiple linear regression being around 0.1, this multiple linear regression had the best R-squared and adjusted R-squared of the other models that we tested, including against only mtemp, only population, or both maximum temperature population, and also a peak or a lagged dependent variable by 1 year. To forecast 2025, we used the World Population Review 2025 projection for population and the maximum of the max temperature values for a more safe and conservative estimate for the short term to obtain a peak hourly load of 3,433.7 megawatts and 887 million kilowatt hours for total consumption. To forecast 2045, we used the SSP scenarios and their projected 2045 global changes in temperature, whereas the most optimistic SSP 1-1.9 explicitly stated the 2045 global change in temperature in accordance with the Paris Agreement. The rest did not, so we had to calculate them using the below transformation, which is in line with our first assumption that projected global temperature growth is approximately linear over the 78-year period from 2022 to 2100, as future changes in global temperature is based on highly unpredictable physical, political, and industrial factors. We also assume that there are no major technological advancements that improve AC technology in the next 20 years, as it is extremely difficult to predict the onset and impact of innovation. To forecast 2045, we use the University of Tennessee's Boyd Center's 2045 projection for population and the various scenario-adjusted global changes in temperature to get a maximum peak hourly load of 3,563 megawatts. For sensitivity analysis, we analyze the percent differences of the max and min values for peak hourly load and total consumption respectively, and we get these low percent differences in spite of fairly significant changes in temperature, indicating the resilience of our model. The biggest strength of our model is the use of regression analysis over univariate time series analysis with two key predictors that make logical sense in the context of the problem. Additionally, we use scenario analysis, which is in line with expert projections in the literature. However, since our model is based on expert projections, it may require dynamic revisiting as these projections change over time. Also, we could have investigated more additional variables, including other demographic factors or climate factors. I will now pass it over to Vivian to talk about Q3.
Question 3, Beat the Heat, asks us to develop a vulnerability score and use them in order to help Memphis neighborhoods equitably allocate resources for minimizing the effects of a heat wave, such as in Q1, or a power grid failure, such as in Q2. To guide our model, we established 3 key assumptions. First, that the effects of a heat wave fall under 3 key consequence types: population health, agricultural loss, and building or infrastructure damage. This allows for a comprehensive review of all heat wave impacts. Additionally, fatalities and other health complications can be monetarily quantified using value of a statistical life. Following federal standards, we treat 1 fatality or 10 severe injuries as $11.6 million in economic loss, allowing for a common unit of measurement across our key consequence types, leading us into our final assumption that heat wave effects can be monetarily quantified using expected annual loss, or EAL, which is the combined sum of our 3 loss types. This is a standard metric used by FEMA's National Risk Index to estimate the long-term effects of natural hazards, or in our case specifically, heat waves. We define our vulnerability score as a measure of a population's susceptibility to harmful effects quantified by EAL due to a heat wave. We collected census tract data from FEMA in order to sum those EAL values of census tracts that overlapped with the zip code boundaries of Memphis neighborhoods. But we then wanted to analyze what predictors could accurately predict the severity of these losses, leading us to use a multiple linear regression to analyze the relationship between neighborhood risk factors and the predicted expected annual loss. Our initial regression involves several potential predictors identified from current literature shown below. But while socioeconomic factors such as age or income are correlated with heat wave vulnerability, they're also correlated with each other. And these intercorrelations could lead to a misleading or inaccurate regression. To address this, we implemented backward variable selection until all predictors were statistically significant. Our 4 final predictors were the proportion of households with elderly, the proportion of households with children, the total population, and the number of residents aged 16 and older who commute via walking or public transport. We then constructed our vulnerability scores using the previously identified predictors with the regression coefficients as their weights. These vulnerability scores were then normalized using min-max scaling and finally multiplied by 100 for an interpretable and standardized scale from 0 to 100. Now, Ramya will discuss our vulnerability score results.
The map depicts the geographic impacts of the vulnerability on heat waves, with darker red shades indicating higher vulnerability and darker green shades indicating lower vulnerability. This map allows us to identify high-risk areas of Memphis, such as the east and west corners, guiding resource allocation. Additionally, the table depicts the 10 neighborhoods with the highest vulnerability scores, which would benefit from targeted intervention. Our results identified the neighborhood with the highest vulnerability as Hickory Wide, with a score of 100. Hickory Wide stands out due to its large proportion of households with elderly individuals and children. On the other hand, downtown has a score of 0, which makes intuitive sense given its urban and younger demographic profile. This indicates that age demographics play a large role in vulnerability due to heat waves. To assess the reliability of our model, we conduct a sensitivity analysis. We jittered our parameters and found that the average percent difference in our vulnerability scores was only 3.47%, indicating that our model is robust against small changes in our input parameters. We offer the following policy approach to Memphis based on our model, which we discussed with our congressman who approved of its feasibility and legislative ability. We think that we should install cooling centers in high-risk areas, shade structures at transit stops, and offer tax incentives or rebates for shade solutions to both homeowners and landlords. Our biggest strength lies in our use of expected annual loss, which not only accounts for outcomes in health, but also agriculture and building value. However, we could consider additional predictors, and correlation does not imply causation. Overall, this challenge asks us to model how Memphis can prepare for the growing threat of extreme heat, from individual homes to the city's infrastructure to its most at-risk communities. For problem 1, we used a differential equation model, finding that shade coverage alone can lower indoor temperatures by several degrees. For problem 2, we used a multiple linear regression with scenario analysis, finding that Memphis will need to support a peak load of over 3,500 megawatts by 2045, indicating a need for proactive grid investment. For model 3, we found that age demographics play a large role in vulnerability after a heat wave. At the end of the day, these aren't just models. They're about real people affected by heat waves. People experiencing homelessness, people unable to afford AC, elderly, children, and the mother in Memphis struggling just to help her daughter breathe are at risk. Our goal is to equip Memphis with the tools to act early, efficiently, and equitably. The risks are rising, but so is our ability to protect the people most affected. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Susie, do you want to start us with a question?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and all your work. Like 2 slides back, maybe, you have your vulnerability scores, and you talked about your recommendations. And
Yes.
did you say you had a discussion with the policy? Was
Oh,
that a
yes.
real discussion, or was this a synthetic discussion? Did
No,
you-
so I had access to our congressman, which is known for his policy advocacy. And after we found out that we were being finalists, we realized that we should reach out to him and discuss if these policies were even legislatively feasible and fiscally feasible. And what he told us is that they not only align with our federal priorities, but they would also make Memphis eligible for federal resilience grants, ensuring that they don't bear the burden alone.
This is wonderful. So this is really the goal of M3, get you thinking and working on real-world problems, and I'm glad you followed up. So thank you. This is awesome.
Okay, my question is about your part one. Your model to predict the indoor temperature included several factors that affect the heat transfer. What other factors did you consider, or if you were to start the problem over, would you think about any other factors to consider, to include into your model?
Yeah, absolutely. So scientifically, our model is based on a physical law that requires the assumption that the indoor temperature is uniform across the entirety of the home. Now, this is not necessarily always true. There are plenty of, for example, heat pumps is a new and upcoming system that is designed to redistribute heat throughout the home that may influence the presence, like the distribution of temperature and thus the efficacy of heat transfer across walls and solar radiation. Now, we chose not to consider some of these factors due to, number one, for example, heat pumps not being extremely prevalent in architecture yet, as well as simply keeping the model relatively simple. It is a lot of factors to consider, and as you can see in our final equation, it's already quite complicated. And ultimately, we decided that this was sufficient due to its alignment with the expected values, especially found in newspaper articles, as we demonstrated on one of our later slides. Yes, right there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about your vulnerability score, in particular about the coefficients. In your results, your coefficient for population is negative, and your coefficient for the median household income is positive. What was your reaction when you saw that, and what are the implications for what that means for your score?
Yeah, it actually did confuse us at first because we thought, oh, population-wise, the coefficient negative. But after analyzing Memphis as a city itself, we also saw that population recently has been declining, which could also contribute to the negative coefficient.
Remind me, these coefficients came from a least squares regression, and what was the variable being predicted?
The variable being predicted was expected annual loss.
Okay, which was obtained, like, this is published by someone, or where's that data from?
It was from FEMA's National Risk Index, the census tract data.
Ah, okay. So it's not clear to, maybe I'll push back on that answer a little bit. It's not clear to me why Memphis's declining population would factor into that.
So the negative coefficient basically means as population increases, the loss decreases in like these certain areas, right?
Okay.
So then this means that, well, population is increasing in a certain neighborhood. What it also means is that it's getting more urbanized and there's more factors and more cooling centers, more ability for Memphis currently to support people dealing with the effects of heat waves. So that's why we hypothesized that population had a negative coefficient. And median income, as median income increases, I think it's a similar thing where number one, it wasn't statistically significant, so we found that in the end, this actually didn't play into our model. But this is definitely something we would definitely look into further and maybe research about like the income demographics and how income is spread throughout Memphis by even analyzing a heat map of income versus the heat map that we created.
Okay. Okay, it makes sense. So it's like the declining population is telling us something different about the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And-
Yeah.
I have one final question, which was so for part two, I loved how you used these SSP scenarios, because as we saw from Professor Mura's talk, that's sort of like an industry standard. One thing I wanted to ask about is they have these projected global temperature changes, which I guess is a projection of average global change. And I'm wondering, do you believe that will change, like how will the change in average temperature impact the change in, say, peak temperature? Like at the end of the day, for this question, you guys emphasize peak power use. So what's the connection between this like average temperature change and say peak temperature change in a city?
Yeah, so we noticed that, and actually in our 2045 projections, we added these average changes in global temperature to the average peak temperatures from the average maximum temperatures from the provided data set from 2012 to 2022. So instead of using 103 degrees Fahrenheit for a short-term estimate, we used 99.14 degrees Fahrenheit, which was the average of all the 10 data points that were given. And you asked about the...
Like I might think, I'm just guessing. I might think that the increase in peak temperature would be more than the increase in the average.
Yeah, so I get, to forecast 2045, since this is long-term forecasting, we thought it would be, we use the averages for a more like robust estimate.
Okay.
Yeah, but we will definitely look into that further.
Okay, cool.
I think I understand what you're saying is that that these peak temperatures would probably increase more due to these climate changing concepts, though these again depend on very variable factors like political, economic, and other social things that we can't easily predict. So we decided to just use the average temperature in these changes to predict our model right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's thank the team. So your representative, yeah, go ahead. If you want to say words of thank you, this is the time to do it.
Yeah, sure. I want to thank, first of all of the organizers for M3 Challenge and Cyan for hosting us. Also Jane Street for giving us this wonderful venue and making this day possible. I want to thank our parents back at home, our teachers for being like such a valuable audience and giving us great advice when preparing for a presentation. I want to thank first and foremost, our coach, Mrs. Everett, and her husband for helping chaperone us here in New York City. It was a really fun time here. Yeah, thank you.